Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Our next presenter is Johannes Kronenberg. He's a research associate at the section for agriculture at the Goetheanum in Dornach, Switzerland. His current work focuses on the intersection of sustainable development and the contributions of anthroposophy to this field. And his paper is titled Anthroposophy's Contributions to Sustainable Development.
So warm greetings from the Goetheanum here in Switzerland. And it's a great honor to be part of this conference. And thank you very much also for the previous presenters. And I was supposed to be there in person, but unfortunately I had to cancel my trip a few days ago because of family circumstances. But still, I'm of course very happy to be able to contribute in this digital way. And therefore, I modified my presentation a bit to focus and adjust it to the digital format. And therefore, I would like to start sharing some of my slides. So I would like to share with you Anthroposophy's contributions to sustainable development. And I will try to give you a brief introduction into this research question of what the contributions are of anthroposophy to sustainable development. Then I would like to take a few minutes on the actual question of the definition of sustainable development. And then I had to focus on just a few parts of this contribution, which I decided to limit myself to the so-called integral worldview, the interdependence between inner and outer development, an appropriate anthropocentrism, and a threefold social organism. So the actual question, what the contributions are of anthroposophy to sustainable development, was a research gap until 2017. And Nathaniel Williams already introduced it. The first one was Dan McKennon, who answered a part of this question of what the contributions are to the broader environmental movement in his book, Eco-Alchemy, which he really did a very profound work. And it indeed delivered the inspiration to the other work that came out of it, which was just published recently, which my dear colleague and myself worked on and edited and made the book together with 70 or more than 70 other authors around the world to make a compendium about the question of what are actually these contributions of anthroposophy to sustainable development. So in these two volumes, you will find an exhaustive answers and perspectives on this question. And now I will need to limit myself, of course, for this time to come. Can you still hear me? I see. Yeah, also in the room? Okay. So sustainable development was one of the first original responses as a discipline to the so-called socio-ecological polycrisis. And the image you see now of the Earth, it's called the blue marble, is one of the most famous and used pictures in the history of humanity. And it's one of the first pictures of the Earth from outside as a globe in high resolution. And the same moment that this picture was made by the crew of the NASA Apollo missions, the sustainable development came into being as an institutionalized global discipline. And there was, of course, you can say 200-300 years of work before of people that were already working towards a notion or a discipline that was later called sustainable development. It started in Germany already in 1800, and it took a travel to, of course, the United States and the conservative movement. So it had a broad history. But in the 80s, it got institutionalized by the Brundtland Commission. And this commission worked 900 days on the question what the response of humanity should be to the global situation. And they came with a definition that sustainable development is a development that needs to meet of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And as you can see on this picture, as you can see on this picture on the left, there's the president of Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway. She was leading the commission for 900 days together with 22 delegate countries. And you see here the traditional visualization of what sustainable development was and still is today. So it is the ecological pillar, the social pillar of society, and within that embedded economy. And up until today, this is the only agreed upon definition that there is, although a meta-study reviewed by 5 African universities only 2 years ago indicated that there are approximately 200 valid academic definitions, which makes sustainable development overused and undefined, they call it in the discipline. But I refer to Brundtland because it's still the only agreed upon definition. Sustainable development was a response to what was called later the so-called Great Acceleration and the start of the Anthropocene, the age or the era of humanity. And here in the left, you see a graph, which is called by some scientists the most important statistic or graph of this century, coming from a report from Will Steffen from Australia. And here you can see that in the 50s, there was something starting what later was called the Great Acceleration, here expressed by human beings coming to Earth, one could say. So in only 2 generations' time, the global community rose from 2 to 8 billion people. And because this life well-being carrying supporting systems was all based on industrial sector, the economy, you could say, crossed planetary boundaries, as we call it today, and caused a lot of social justice. Just one example, that still today, 20% of the world's population, which is you included, use 80% of the world's resources, and thereby creating a massive social injustice. So this is the actual situation where sustainable development was a response to. Nowadays, to say something brief about the status of this discipline is that there is a double crisis with sustainable development as we speak of today. The first part is being defined by the geopolitical situation we experience nowadays. So global sustainable development efforts were pushed off many political agendas since the last month this year, and a lot of investment banks and so on also pulled back of their projects. So this is a first happening that created a shock for the sustainable development movement. Another one was from within. Professor for sustainable development in Vienna, Blühdorn, formulated in a way that the movement imploded in itself and is actually experiencing an identity crisis because they see that what they wanted since the 60s didn't happen. So the social and ecological situation on the earth did not get better. It only decreased and got worse in the latest reports of many organizations. So this is, so to say, the double crisis where the sustainable development discipline is nowadays located. And then, of course, I just name a few perspectives. You have people that say, well, it's a management tool, it is an eco-dictatorship, it's a technocratic, one-sided Western approach to society. For example, also philosophers say it's a neo-colonial tool of Western societies to impose definitions of development to others. So there are many, many different discourses on the sustainable development subject. But in its core, it is still holding the question, who are we and where do we want to go together on this planet? And this is something I think anthroposophy is very clearly showing and contributing to. So to select a few contributions of anthroposophy to sustainable development, I try to give a broad overview. And of course, one has to notice or to realize that there are thousands of enterprises and initiatives and communities in the world that work with ecological efforts, with social efforts that try to create alternative local and beyond local economic situations. And if you want to know more about these initiatives, you can take a look at the second publication I named before, because there are a lot of these practical initiatives described. So I will not go now into these practical contributions as examples. So the first contribution I want to highlight is the so-called integral worldview. So anthroposophy provides an integral worldview as prerequisite for sustainable development. And this was being stated by Professor for Sustainable Development in 2011 of the Netherlands. And he's maybe one of the major and first professors of sustainable development actually in the discourse. And he was a major advisor for the Dutch government as well. And he set up a big research with 40,000 people where he asked, what are your value orientations and what kind of worldviews can be derived from your value orientation? And after his research with his team, they came on the circle you can see on the right, indicating 12 different views or worldviews he translated it into. And the four basic, the X that is showing the four qualities of the upper part more connected to the immaterial or the spiritual, the down part to the materialistic or the material world, the right part to the individualistic, and the left part to the collective quality. And he was saying in this in his statement that we need an integral worldview to get to sustainable development, meaning not getting into one extreme you see in this circle. So trying to find an equilibrium in the middle of these 12 worldviews. That was his statement and of his colleagues in the University of Utrecht. And he gave examples. If, for example, we go into religious fundamentalism, we might end up into religious wars or into guillotine actions and so on. If we go into an extreme of materialism, we eventually will destroy the earth and the carrying natural organisms around ourselves. And he said, so meaning sustainable development needs an integral worldview moving in a circling way in the middle between all these others. And Steiner, on top of this, formulated according Demme canon a gift to the environmental movement, which he calls cosmic holism, where Steiner formulates in his own word, we must extend our view to the whole cosmos and summon all the universe into our councils. So here you can see an element of this broad integral worldview, which McCannon calls a cosmic holism. And Steiner himself, as the researchers also indicate to, spoke about this or wrote about this in the work Human and Cosmic Thoughts, where he came towards a similar depiction of these 12 worldviews. And for him, it was very important that to notice that we should not think that one is better than the other. It is a matter of finding an access or an entry towards the perception of reality and trying to indeed, as Van Egmond also said, find the middle. So this was the first distinct contribution to sustainable development. And as the researchers in Utrecht in the Netherlands state, an actually prerequisite to come towards the so-called sustainable development. A second major contribution is what I call the interdependence between inner and outer development. So the well-known citation or quote of Steiner saying, if you seek yourself, look out into the world. If you seek the world, look into yourself, is indicating this quality of the interdependence of the inner and the outer realities. And anthroposophy's esoteric schooling work is, of course, very strongly connected to the ancient Greek work and, for example, also to the Delphic maxim, know thyself. And know thyself was written above the temple of Apollo, next to the other Delphic maxim, nothing in excess. And there was a third one as well. And this know thyself is indicating towards this inner development, and nothing in excess, one could say, is indicating towards this outer development or transformation and the interdependence of both. And this inner schooling path of anthroposophy is a central practice in many professional working fields that anthroposophy is connected to, as many of you know probably. And strikingly enough, in agriculture, it's interesting, and Nathaniel William already quoted it, that the biodynamic agriculture is considered as the first organic agriculture in the history. And when Steiner gave the course to the farmers, he was promoting and actually telling the farmers it would be very good if you try to integrate a meditative life, so an inner practice for your work, so that your perception gets more sensitive for the natural world around. So already 100 years ago, he was not only introducing inner development, but connecting it to the very fact that we need, with this inner development, transform the outer substance of, in this case, the earth. And this was absent for the last decades of sustainable development. It was not a part of the sustainable development discourse until 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, the so-called inner development goals were introduced by 1,000 scientists and many different universities. Harvard University was part of this initiative. And also the so-called inner Green Deal as prerequisite for sustainable development were introduced just 5 years ago. And these two models, I will not tell too much about it, they basically say what Steiner was saying 100 years ago to the farmers. If you want to transform a certain social system or a part of society, no matter what it is, you should address this inner schooling path of each individual. So something that has entered the sustainable development discourse 5 years ago on United Nations level was there since 100 years in the anthroposophical approach. So this is the second contribution of anthroposophy to sustainable development as well. A third one is what McKenna calls an appropriate anthropocentrism. And in this understanding, the human being is not a ruler or a destroyer, nor an observer or a participant, and also not a conserver or a protector of the earth, but a co-creator of the presence, a co-creating presence of the earth or on the earth. So the human being has a very distinct role to transform the substance of the earth, is what Steiner is saying. And the earth is not seen as a broken machine in need of repair or a system that needs to be regenerated. This is a very popular language in sustainable development. We need to regenerate the systems, is being quoted all the time. But Steiner says, no, the earth is a living organism in a path of interdependent development, which then McKenna calls in his book planetary transmutation. And this is a highly, I would say, provocative statement in the environmental movement, because then one would say, well, this is very anthropocentric. You put the human being in the center of evolution, on top of evolution, but exactly this is not what Steiner meant and what a lot of anthroposophical practitioners mean. It is this co-creative, interdependent process of development that is meant. And Steiner is expressing this in one quote: "Our Mother Earth has hardened through pain. Our mission is to spiritualize her again by reworking her through the power of our hands into a spirit-filled work of art." So the actual task, the definition of sustainable development, is not only to secure current and future generations' fulfillment of their needs, but there is an actual endeavor to create a work of art of the very earth itself. The fourth contribution I want to highlight is, of course, the threefold social organism, which is, of course, complex to do in a few minutes. But this approach to society can be seen as an early pioneering sustainable development approach with striking similarities to approach defined by the United Nations back in the 80s. I will show you that in a minute. And it integrates all the traditional pillars of sustainable development, so ecological, social, and economic, but also extracts and differentiates out of the social pillar the cultural one. So Steiner is actually introducing a fourth pillar of sustainable development, the cultural, spiritual one, which is actually, one could say, innovating the whole, who is impulsating the whole. And furthermore, the freedom or liberty and equality and solidarity or fraternity are guiding principles that give a clear direction to each of the realms of sustainable development, which is also a very decisive contribution. Here I very briefly show you the difference. So on the left, you see the traditional understanding of sustainable development. And on the right, you can say is what the social threefold organism approach already introduced decades before it was formulated by the United Nations, but with the differentiation of what I said, the cultural sphere as being an innovator of the whole, and adding these attributes of freedom, equality, and solidarity. And here you could say it's not only a pioneering contribution and a predecessor of sustainable development, but it's also answering a need to go and work with this double crisis, I call it, where sustainable development is in now, and also the rise of the sensitivity for this inner dimension in sustainable development, which is also very new. And this, as my last slide, results in a new understanding of sustainable development that was being crafted in September in Cairo, in the desert of Cairo, in Sechem, together with 150 people and many different organizations. We worked on a new narrative for sustainable development, and this looked like this. Here you can clearly see that the traditional pillars were included, that the social treefolding is included, and what always was implicit, also for Sechem, I don't know if all of you know it, maybe not, but for Sechem, as a United Nations awarded champion of the earth, the inner development is in the core of the whole sustainable development model. This was always implicit, but now is explicit. And at the same time, you can see the so-called spiritual and cosmic sources, which one can say is the understanding that the human being is not only here to conserve or protect the earth or to regenerate it, but to co-create into a next step in an interdependent path of development. And this new draft or new understanding of sustainable development or of development in general is, of course, you can say not new. You can find in many different streams, whether it is Renaissance or German idealism or even in indigenous knowledge, you can find the notion of inner and outer transformation. But you can say it's reintroduced in a secular and academic context again through anthroposophy. And I would state to close that this was there from the beginning, 100 years ago, especially around the 1920s. And along the 100 years of anthroposophy, this was developed into many practical and theoretical contributions, resulting in this possible new narrative of sustainable development, which we are currently working on to share with many other organizations and universities around the world. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would have loved to meet you in person, but I will do it from the screen.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the Preston Fellows of Harvard College.